Saunders. So I'll be talking about Black female autonomy and introducing a little bit about me first. So as we reimagine Black female bodily autonomy, and just before we say me first rather than me too, it is important to acknowledge the power of the archive. So by the archive, I'm speaking specifically to cultural memory, history to some, our story to others, that which captures the essence of what was and provides a foundation for what is. So when we think about Black female bodily abduction and placement onto the American soil, though this is not the beginning of our story, it marks a unique page. So as we say the names of the Black women that make up this narrative, it is important that we as Black women archive these stories as well. So particularly I want to talk about Rebecca Skloot's text, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and Danielle McGuire's The Dark End of the Street. So these are books that speak to a significant page of the Black women's narrative. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks speaks to Henrietta Lacks, who of course had cervical cancer, and she was exploited in her life, and her cells are actually helped save many people, even though she died at the age of 31 and was buried in an unmarked grave. This was archived by a white woman, and there were significant gaps in the story and in a significant perspective that was taken that wasn't necessarily favorable to Black women. Danielle McGuire's At the Dark End of the Street, she rewrites the civil rights movement from a feminist perspective. Feminism functions as a form of white female supremacy, and that is, it places the Black narrative in a frame that's anti-Black. So it's very, very important that as we think about these stories, as we say these names, that we're in charge of the narrative that goes out to everyone else, and that what will provide the history for our children. So when we talk about me first, I speak specifically to working to make sure that our story isn't erased, even though it appears to be archived. So we think about moving past the inclusionary narrative, that we're not trying to be included, we're trying to be central, so we thwart the feminist intervention. So when we say me first, we make room for the lost pages in an abductive narrative. When we say me first, we reimagine and reconfigure Black female bodily autonomy beyond the burden of white comfort, beyond the burden of a physically battered body, into a body of work yet to be assembled or acknowledged. So when we say me first, we make room for the Tawana Brawley, and she's no longer a hoax, but she's a heroine. She's a her worthy of a story.
Next we'll hear from Alexis.
So I was thinking of the idea of bodily autonomy and medicine in the healthcare field, and I was kind of caught up into the idea of narratives and the body. And when I use the term the body, Black female body, I am both speaking literally of yourself, of your bodily self, but at the same time when we view the Black female body as a collection of Black women, and what narratives have been formed around that, and who is necessarily forming these narratives that then inform women when they go into the hospital, when they go into the doctor's office. Here I have pictured J. Marion Sims, who's known as the father of modern gynecology. Right. And as a quick rundown, he essentially became famous or invented gynecology by operating on, or finding a solution to vaginal fistulas, but he did so by operating on enslaved Black women with no painkillers, under the premise that Black women do not feel pain, or they do not feel pain in the same way that a white woman does. In essence, their bodies are disposable. And that is a very archaic example, yet at the same time, I bring that up because you see it being reified in the 21st century. Under that, I have a graph that has Black women's U.S. maternal death rate, and generally speaking, Black women, and this is regardless of their personal ethnicity, this is meaning if they are African American women, or maybe women who have moved from the continent to the United States, or the children of people from the continent who have moved to the United States, are 3 to 4 times more likely to have either complications, if not dying mid-childbirth while they are in the hospital. And this is still all built off of this narrative of the Black female body as worth less, or even women not necessarily being able to narrate their own bodies and say, I am in pain, I need painkillers, this is what I need. So we see these different narratives being placed onto Black women because the healthcare system is so essentially ran by rich white people for all intents and purposes who do not necessarily center Black women in their concerns. And then we also see things like narratives of fat phobia being put onto women where they might go into a doctor's office and say, my leg is hurting. The doctors will say, well, maybe you need to lose some weight without giving them an x-ray, without doing anything. They might have a tumor. That was a specific story that I read in a text that I'll tell you about in a second. But at the same time, I also wanted to talk about solutions and how women are reclaiming this narrative of their body. So I have a picture of Erykah Badu up there. Why? She's a doula, exactly. A doula, a midwife. This is a traditional form of nursing, of helping women through childcare, through the prenatal and postnatal purpose, usually in their own home or maybe in a smaller hospital setting. And the reason why that's important is because this is a movement that many Black women are starting to get into. There are several cities, specifically New York, St. Louis, Durham, DC come up a lot, these largely Black populated cities, where you see Black women kind of using this traditional training that has worked for thousands of years to birth children. It's very important that these are Black women with medical training that are doing this. There are also, and these are a couple of texts I'm going to mention, Invisible Visits, Black Middle-Class Women in the American Healthcare System by Tina Sachs. She specifically looks at storytelling as a way to narrate the body. So she has the facts and statistics there, but at the same time she's giving women the ability to tell their own stories and narrate their body and the experiences that they've had in healthcare. Another one which takes a more historical approach that I highly recommend would be Medical Apartheid by Harriet A. Washington, and that looks at the entire history of medicine in the United States and how it was built off of Black bodies and the way that Black bodies were often experimented upon or just treated detrimentally in the healthcare system. So I say all that to say, again, we do have an issue with Black women not being able to narrate their own bodies, but at the same time, I would be remiss to not mention the fact that we see Black women trying to kind of seize their own narrative and see, well, how can we look back to different traditions, or how can we just tell our own stories so you don't walk into a hospital and not walk out, essentially. So I just kind of wanted to leave on that note.
Thank you. Next we'll hear from Forrest.
So pictured here is a small list of names of Black women, emphasize small list of names, but there are many more, who were physically assaulted, sexually abused, and or murdered either by the police or with the support of police and larger legal institutions. It's important to state that the physical and sexual abuse against Black women is testified in numerous books and essays. It's not about sex, but it's about power and maintaining institutions of white supremacy and capitalism. So the hashtag Say Her Name in remembrance of Sandra Bland is used to highlight and give voice to the violence against Black women, centering their experiences in larger conversations of police brutality that are often, when discussed, especially in the mainstream media, are centered around Black men. So this slide offers a few examples of Black women who defended themselves and faced further abuse in the legal system. First, in 1947, Rosalie Ingram was attacked by a white neighbor in Ellaville, Georgia. Within hearing distance of the attack, her two sons, Wallace and Sammy Lee, came to their mother's aid and resulted in killing the attacker. They were all sentenced to death in a rather quick trial and served 12 years in prison. After 12 years in prison, with the help of the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, a women's civil rights organization, Rosalie and her sons were released from prison. Almost 3 decades later, in 1974, Joan Little was charged with first-degree murder for killing a white prison guard where she had been incarcerated in Washington, North Carolina. Little testified that the guard had attempted to rape her and that she killed him with an ice pick he had threatened her with. She was declared innocent, becoming the first Black woman to receive an acquittal on the grounds of self-defense against sexual violence, though clearly her case did not set a precedent for Black women in self-defense. Because in 2010, Marissa Alexander was charged with aggravated assault for firing a warning shot at her abusive husband. She was sentenced to a mandatory minimum of 20 years in prison in Jacksonville, Florida. Her case gained somewhat widespread attention due to the contrast in Trayvon Martin's murder being acquitted in 2013 under Florida's Stand Your Ground laws. Alexander had pled self-defense under the Stand Your Ground law in her case, coincidentally, against the same prosecutor in Trayvon Martin's murder case. Alexander was found guilty and spent several years in prison, as well as on house arrest, until being released in 2017. During her house arrest in 2016, Alexander started the Marissa Alexander Justice Project, which states on its website, a mission to, quote, work with survivors of domestic abuse, members of vulnerable communities and schools, law enforcement, lawyers, and policymakers to secure justice and provide proper support to those navigating the intersection of violence and criminal justice, end quote. And lastly, Centoya Brown Long, who was released from prison only a few months ago after serving 15 years in prison for shooting a 43-year-old white man whom she had been trafficked to at the age of 16 years old. She pled self-defense, but was convicted as an adult, again at 16 years old, in Tennessee, was convicted as an adult of aggravated robbery and first-degree murder and sentenced to a life in prison. So again, she was just released just a few months ago. And last month, she released her memoir, Free Centoya, My Search for Redemption in the American Prison System. There's just, again, some examples of women who defended themselves and, you know, eventually gained freedom, but were just further abused in the legal system. And here is just a few alternatives to the police. Unfortunately, they're not necessarily numbers that you can call as opposed to calling 911. And of course, not calling the police is the first and most concrete alternative, which applies far more to white people who call the police way too often on black people for just being black people. But of course, this applies to all people. With the case of Tatiana Jefferson, we see calling the police even for a non-emergency situation can end up in the death of black women. So again, listed in this slide, it's just a few alternatives, organizations that are working to decenter or abolish police as the arbiters of power in law enforcement in black communities. So the Stop Police Terror Project, DC, of course that's located here in Washington, DC. It's an offshoot of the DC Ferguson movement, which you know, began, I believe it was 2013. They operate under several principles, such as, quote, the self-determination of black communities, actively challenging and seeking replacements to oppressive policing systems, and the belief that the police cannot be reformed. They're currently focusing on challenging DC's stop and frisk policies. Information and events calendar can be found at their website, and they also have an Instagram page. They might have a Twitter page too. The African American Policy Forum, or AAPF, is located in New York City. They work to challenge oppressive systems such as police across the country. Their website describes the organization as an innovative think tank that connects academics, activists, and policymakers. And in collaboration with the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies at Columbia Law School, directed by Kimberly Crenshaw, the AAPF published a 48-page brief titled Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women, along with a 13-page social media guide, both of which are available on their website. And lastly, the Black Women's Defense League, or BWDL. It was created in 2017 by Nisi X in Dallas, Texas. It was influenced by women in the Black Panther Party in the 1970s. The BWDL advocates for black women's gun ownership to combat violent oppression, including that from police brutality, as well as highlighting the contradictory nature of gun ownership in America that criminalizes black gun ownership and protects white gun ownership. The BWDL identifies as a womanist organization, which they demonstrate by their community outreach, including free breakfast programs, as well as offering firearms safety and training events to black women. The BWDL, as a new movement, they have a desire to spread throughout the country. So currently they're in Dallas, Texas, but they do just kind of speak to that one alternative being gun ownership, specifically black gun ownership.
Thank you. And because the full conversation is so important, I just want to remind you that we have index cards for you to write down your questions if you have any for the panelists, and I'll come around and collect them from you. And finally, last but not least, of course, we have Mewalu.
So, okay. I want to say thank you to Ms. Catherine because she spoke so eloquently on how important artifacts are and how we should reclaim how we are written about our history. You know, that's a really big thing. So many people are speaking for us, writing for us, and you see it in the media all the time. It reflects not us, right? And I'm thankful to Ms. Alexis because, you know, we see it in the media all the time. I don't know if you guys know about the example with Serena Williams and her pregnancy, and how she had to really advocate, something's wrong with me. She went to the doctor and the doctor said, yeah, you're fine. She had to advocate to the point that what was it, blood clots that they found? Right. And then Mr. Forrest, he talked about the intersection of how academics like us can possibly deinstitutionalize a lot of the institutions that serve against us. Not saying all ways fight the power, but there are ways, more than one way to skin a cat, for lack of a better way of saying that. My name is Mewalu. I'm a social worker. I've been working in the field since 2003. I don't look like it, but I have. With that being said, I'm an active social worker in DC. So I'm bringing the perspective of, you know, what's around, okay? Now I'm gonna be completely honest with you guys. As a social worker, there are a lot of, you know, what's it called, assumptions and stereotypes of what social workers do. I'm none of those things. But what I can say is, even though I'm giving you this non-exhaustive list of what can be supports for you guys, or for someone that you may know or need support, the reality is sometimes you need that extra hand to look between the cracks because there's a lot of red tape, okay? So, actually go back one more, go back to the previous slide. So, you may not see because it's cut off, but local domestic violence resources. These agencies that I pulled from, which is from dc.gov, you can actually go and see a more exhaustive list. And I actually have printouts if folks want copies. These are examples of international hotlines and nonprofits that are located in DC that support those, especially with domestic violence experiences, okay? Some of the nonprofits are gender inclusive, if that makes sense. It's not just to the binary. So I do want to let folks know that they exist out there, okay? Emergency shelters. Now, there's stigma around that, and you know, for those who have experienced that experience of living in a shelter, that may not be the first option, but believe it or not, for women, that's, you know, domestic violence situations are the number one reason why they're homeless in the first place, especially single-headed households of women. So I just wanted to let you know that this is a resource, and these are a couple of agencies that I've worked with, Sasha Groups, for example, and Calvary Women's Services, that do support. And if not, they help navigate other areas of placement for housing, especially for single women or mothers who had households. So you may not read this, but I have printouts, okay? This is not an exhaustive list, but this is the crisis helpline, a general hotline. It may not be domestic violence. It may not be physical violence. It may be other kinds of violence that a woman may navigate against or around. This is the number to call for help. I'm looking at both on Howard's campus, which will be on a couple of other slides, and off of Howard's campus, because we as students, we navigate between the two, right? And some of us, especially since the holidays, and I'll be honest, as a clinician, sometimes the holidays are the hardest times for individuals. You know, this is seasons where you would assume this is a lot of celebration, but a lot of students have to go back home. I'm not going to assume for everyone, but some students don't want to go home because there's stuff that goes on at home, okay? So these are some numbers to call, okay? So crisis hotline, DC citywide sexual assault hotline, House of Ruth, you saw their emblem on the previous slide. Maryland domestic violence hotline, a lot of our students live in Maryland. My Sister's Place, which is a domestic violence hotline. Virginia domestic violence, because I was looking at the Tri-City area, state area, and mental health crisis line. Now, let's be honest. Some folks have really positive experience with being represented legally, and some have really dismissive experiences, okay? I'm still gonna offer some resources of legal services and court services that exist here in DC, okay? Examples such as Ayuda Económico Legal Latina, that's their number right there. Legal Aid Society, primarily for those of low or lesser income levels. Usually they'll, you know, run a credit or they'll run an income bracket just to see if you qualify, and from there, if you meet the criteria, they'll be able to support you legally. So that's a resource. DC's oldest and largest civil legal service organization, the Domestic Violence Family Law Attorneys, represent clients in a wide range of intra-family matters in the DC Superior Court system. I listed that one because they help with custody situations, because that can often come up. This is an example of children are also in the crux of these domestic violence situations. And of course, at the bottom, also from DC Gov as of this year, court services, more services that are available in the DC area. So let's talk about on campus. Big chance if you went through orientation, you've heard of Title IX. They probably made you do a questionnaire or did something to affirm that you attended the orientation. Big chance after orientation and school got busy, you know what the term, you know maybe somewhere on the campus. So I want to let you guys know that I do have handouts of their contact information. And if you live in the dorms, one of their offices is located, I think it's the, help me out if I can't remember the name. It's okay, it's in the basement of one of the actual dorms. What was that? Thank you, thank you. So they do actually have an office there. Usually the protocol is if you don't know where to go, reach out to your respective dean of school or your respective professor and they'll guide you through the networks to have an actual appointment. Primarily it should be confidential, okay? So on campus we have Title IX. The experience in itself of navigating any kind of violence, whether it's interpersonal violence, domestic violence, bullying, whatever phrasing you want to utilize, it can be a very jarring experience. I can only speak from a survivor that sometimes a question that comes up is, if you were going through this situation, why didn't you come sooner? Sometimes it takes time to process through trauma to the point that you feel encouraged enough to actually speak to someone about it because you may not even realize you were going through it, okay? I'm not encouraging folks to share here, but I do tell folks that when you feel that power, when you feel that empowerment, reach out to somebody and have someone connect you, okay? We also have counseling services here on this campus. Granted, I know that's for some people they're easier access than others, but also check the back of your insurance card here at Howard University, because there's that 800 number that you can call. You can actually access that portal to see if you can find counselors that can support you with your insurance off the campus. Folks don't know that, but you can actually call them and say, hey, does my insurance apply towards this individual? A resource that folks may want to use is called Psychology Today. It's a portal, believe it or not, where you can actually screen for your insurance, and also you can see pictures and specific specialty of their profession. If you need a counselor, if it's hard to get it here, check your insurance, look off campus as well. Eat therapy is a thing as well, but not to go off too much on a tangent. These are my resources in terms of what I've provided so far, DC Gov and also Howard's website. You can actually click on these or do a Google search. They will pop up for you with no issue, okay? And that's pretty much the gist for my contribution. I wanted to really just do real-time connections from on campus to off campus. I like it when I go to things and people talk about really big stuff, but also give takeaways that you can walk away from. Because we all can be in that situation at any given time, or may have that friend or family member that may need the help. But the sticky part is, what do we do from there? So that was my contribution.